I've been using GraphQL in production for about 5 years now, and there's certain mistakes that I see developers repeating over and over again. So in this video, I'm going to take you through 5 of those mistakes so you can avoid making them in your GraphQL APIs and make GraphQL APIs that front-end developers absolutely love consuming. So the first mistake here is building a GraphQL API that is essentially a REST API or an RPC API. So GraphQL is fundamentally different to REST, and it's mostly different to RPC. So your mutations are obviously going to be functions that you call on your server, but your queries should return a graph. So a REST API is centered around resources, where a GraphQL API should be centered around serving a graph. What I mean by a graph, I mean a graph has edges and it has nodes. So a node is something like a user, and then an edge could be a user friending another user. If we have a look at this simple schema that I have here, we have products and we have a user. So a product and a user are both going to be nodes, and then we could have edges between the products and the user, or we could have edges between a user and a sale. So for example, a user could make a sale. So let's have a look at the queries for this API and why I think making your queries like this is a mistake. So you can see here that we have a type of query, and then we have a get product. So get is a method. We don't want to get our products. We just want to query our node here, which is a product. So I wouldn't use the word get here. This implies that we're calling a function on the server when your GraphQL API shouldn't actually worry about that. So I would just call this product, lowercase, and then I would also have products here. And it's as simple as that. So this might seem like a really simple change here, and it is, but what it signifies to me if you call your queries get product or get products is that you've thought about your API in terms of a REST API or an RPC API. I want to see that you've thought about your API in terms of serving a graph. So the next mistake that I see developers making is not using input types for mutations. If you don't do this already and you start doing it, you're going to notice a big difference between using inputs for your mutations and not using inputs. And you're also going to be really frustrated when you consume APIs that don't actually do this. So you can see here, we have this mutation to create a product, and we have this long list of inputs here. We have name, description, and price. Now this is not how I would design this API. Instead, what I would do, I would cut all of that out. I'd have one input and I would call this input. And then this would be of type create product input. Now I can create that input type with input, create product input. Now I can put all of these properties in here. And we can also make this required as well. So this again is a simple change, but it makes a big difference when you go to consume your API. So let's have a look at the practical difference between these two mutations. So you can see in this first one here, we have all of our inputs up the top here. And what we're doing here is we're saying we're going to create a variable called name, and that's of type required string. And then down the bottom here, we're going to say for this input, use the variable I created earlier called name. So if we wanted to add a user here, you can see what we have to do is we have to say, okay, create a variable called user. That's going to be of type ID. And then down the bottom here, we have to use this variable. So this is going to be a user, and we're going to use the variable user here. So this is quite annoying. If we come down to our new mutation, if we wanted to add user here, we don't actually have to do anything. All we have to do is start putting user into the input when we call create function. Another tip here is you can actually do this for your queries as well, for their return types. So if we have this query up here for, say, a product. So let's say we have this query here for a product, and now we're just returning a product. But what we can do instead is return a type of product query result. And this is actually going to work better if you're returning multiple products. So let's say for this actually get products, and this is going to be products query result. Now for our products here, we're going to move our products up into there. I'm going to call this items. And then we're going to say our products query returns a products query result. Now in here, we can have our items. We can also have a count, and this is going to be a number. We can also have a page. That could be a number, and you can see where I'm going from here. You can also add some pagination data inside of here or some metadata about that query result. So the third mistake that I see developers making is not returning the modified object from a mutation. So when we return the modified object, it means we can update the cache on the client in place. We don't need to do a refetch. And in most cases, it means we don't need to do a manual update of the cache, depending on what client you're using. So let's have a look at this create product mutation down here. You can see that we're returning a create product result, and this create product result has a success boolean and a message. Now this is completely pointless. There's two problems with this. One, we don't need to tell our client in a success boolean here whether the GraphQL mutation was successful. If it wasn't successful, we're going to get an error inside of a different property. And then secondly, we missed out on the opportunity to send back the modified product so the client can use that to update the cache. Again, what is the purpose of this message? What are you going to put in here that is going to be useful for the client? There's absolutely nothing that you could possibly put in here, especially if it was successful. And even if it wasn't successful, you would put any message inside an error property. The fourth mistake I see developers making is not using field resolvers. So a field resolver allows you to attach a different property onto the property that you've queried or that you've modified. And this allows you to build a graph, and because remember, we're working with GraphQL, and so you should always be serving a graph of data. If you're not serving a graph of data, then you're using GraphQL wrong. You've taken all the downsides of GraphQL and you've taken none of the upsides. So for example, let's say that we query a product and then we want to get the user that owns this product. Let's say on here, we have a user and that's of type user and that's required. So one way that developers might do this is when you query the product, inside of that query, just attach the user. So what happens if this user is not required and the client doesn't query the user? Well, you've queried it from your database and the client isn't going to use it. This defeats the purpose of GraphQL. GraphQL is meant to serve a graph of data that the client needs for that specific query and nothing more, nothing less. So inside of our resolvers, we could say product, and then we could get the user. And then this is going to be a function. We're going to get the root here. And this is going to be of type product. I'm pretending I'm working in TypeScript here. Then we're going to say return users dot find one, where the ID is equal to the root dot user ID, for example. And this is how you would use a field resolver. So the fifth mistake that I see developers making is having several queries for the same node type. Remember, GraphQL is essentially for the front-end developer. It's our job as back-end developers or GraphQL API designers to make it really easy for the client to consume. If we have multiple queries for the same node type, it's going to make it more difficult to consume because that developer needs to know which query they should be calling. So an example of this is we might have a query to get a product. Now we want to be able to get a product by its name, or we want to be able to get a product by its ID. So this developer has created two queries, get product by name, get product by ID. Again, this is more of an RPC style API, and that's not at all what we're building. So what we would do instead is we would say product, then we would have one input. So this would be get product input. Then we would say that input is required. And that input would take a name or an ID, neither of which would be required. And then inside of our resolver, we would determine if they've used the ID or the name. And this makes it really flexible and easy for our clients to consume this API. If you've enjoyed this video or found anything helpful, let me know in the comment section below and make sure you leave a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.